let's talk about the George Floyd Act. I know I don't need to tell you who George Floyd was and what he now represents. What we need to do is not be entertained today, but I need to make certain that I provide you some information concerning this legislation and encourage you to act. And then I'm going to ask you to do some specific things as relates to the passage of this legislation. And this organization, some 129 participants are on here right now throughout the entire state of Texas, will be able to help do that because you are from all over the state of Texas and have ample political muscle, I will say that, in each one of your geographical areas. And that's what it's going to need in order to pass this legislation. Let me start off with my vision concerning criminal justice. We want to make certain that we have a criminal justice system that is fair and equitable. We want to make certain that our police officers, first of all, our law enforcement officers, are able to leave home in the morning and come home at night to their families. We want to make certain that citizens who call the police department, 911, is able to get someone to respond and not have to worry about whether or not someone will end up dead if the police are called. We should be able to have trust in our police department and specifically our police. We need to make certain that they have the resources that are necessary. All of this defund the police, I'm for reimagining policing, not defunding police. I think that particular rhetoric got misused politically during this last election cycle. I don't know if anyone wants to quote unquote defund the police, but we should reimagine policing. And I'm reminded of Chief David Brown, the Dallas Police Department, after that fatal shooting of several police officers back in 2011, I think it was now, where he did a press conference and said that we asked police to do too much. We asked them to babysit. We asked them to be truant officers. We asked them to be dog catchers. We asked them to be therapists, and on and on. There should be a core mission for police. That core mission needs to be funded. And to the extent that they need outside services, i.e. mental health services, we need to make certain those services are funded. And when I say services, I'm talking about the personnel that would be on a call with a police officer answering a mental health call, a domestic violence call. Police officers often put in harm's way. And we've got to make certain we account for that also. But there's another side to it. We know that a few police officers misuse the power that we as citizens have given them over life and death, over liberty. I'm reminded of a call I had this past Saturday from a dear friend of mine who I've been knowing ever since high school. I used to call him my little brother. But you know, he's now been a pastor for probably he's been married for 38 years, so I know he's been a pastor for at least 38 years. And what he was doing, my friends, he was recounting to me being stopped. He was headed to Mississippi. I think it was on Interstate 20, headed that way. And I can't recall what city it was, but he was stopped in a small city. And he said it was in Louisiana, it was not in Texas. And he said that he was going the speed limit because he knew that in that specific area that there was a lot of quote unquote police activity on Interstate 20. He was stopped. The fact is he had his automatic speed deal on his car. So he knew he was going 55 and a 65. To make a long story short, he was with his wife. The police officer immediately started calling him boy. And all of you know that To an African-American man, that's very degrading. You might as well use the N-word. And then he was told to follow the police officer back to the police department. Asked to get out of the car, went into the police department where there were 3 other Anglo officers there. So it's 4 Anglo officers. And when he got in there and tried to start talking to the sergeant about his particular side of it, he was immediately, how should I say, restrained. Basically called a bunch of boys again and said, if you want to get out here tonight, as opposed to spend the night in jail, you need to come up with $300 cash. Fortunately, he had the $300 in cash. Otherwise, with his wife in the car, he would have been placed in jail. No one would have known where he was. And given the behavior of those officers, what would have happened to his wife? When we begin to look at experiences like that, encountered by African-American men specifically, disproportionately, when we begin to think about what this country witnessed in Minneapolis in terms of the death of George Floyd, when we begin to witness the coming together of people of every ethnic group in this country like never before, when we begin to witness the outrage of people all over this world, we know now is the time to act. Even though here in America we have been distracted by a former president that led the way for insurrection, we're now in legislative session and something must be done about it during this session. Towards that particular end, working with Representative Sophronia Thompson, both of us have filed the George Floyd Act. And let me just hit the high points of the act so you'll know exactly the areas that we are covering in this legislation. We're looking at areas of making certain that we redefine the duties of police officers to intervene when they know that their partner is doing something against the law, against the internal policy of the police department. We've also put in there, in many instances, police officers, for some strange reason, don't want to identify themselves when they're stopping or interacting with a citizen. So we're putting in there a duty to identify, a duty to render aid. How many times have you seen instances where police use deadly force and a person is left there and ultimately bleeds out and dies? Want to make it a duty. We also make it a duty to make certain that if we have a Class C misdemeanor that's punishable only by a fine, that we take away, in most instances, an officer's discretion to arrest someone, except for in instances of assaultive offenses. We're taking that away. Now, if the officer, if a warrant out or something like that, then obviously the police officer would be able to do that. But if the only issue is a traffic offense, or even if it's a misdemeanor assault where it's fine only, we give the officer discretion in that instance to arrest, depending upon what the facts and circumstances are. But in many instances where it's just a fine only, we take away the ability of the officer to arrest. We also, in the bill, look at the use of force. We prohibit chokeholds, and I think most law enforcement would agree with that. We eliminate certain allowable use of lethal force and requires that the use of force there has to be an intimate threat of serious bodily injury or death. And that's the only alternative. The use of that force is the only alternative reasonably available to that officer, protecting him or herself or a third person. We look at the issue of qualified immunity, which will be a part of this legislation. That frankly basically says if an officer violates someone's constitutional right, that he or she should be held personally accountable, and the city should be held accountable to, given the fact that the city is over the police department or the city manager, and they're responsible for, number one, recruiting and training and continuing to provide updated training to those officers. We look at the issue of progressive sanctions. There needs to be some clarity. There needs to be some clarity as it relates to what are the sanctions that should be meted out to a police officer that has been found to violate the law or the policies of the police department, and they should be progressive. And so we look at progressive sanctions as it relates to this legislation. Chokeholds are banned under this legislation also. And so that kind of gives you an overall picture of some of the main points in the legislation. And I want to be able to spend the bulk of our time answering your questions. But before I do that, I also said I wanted to make certain that I provide you food for thought concerning what you can personally do, what this organization can do throughout the state of Texas. I think it's real important that you act as advocates. How do you act as advocates? You need to get with your local chief of police, your local mayor, city council, and urge support of the legislation. Now, don't get me wrong. The legislation is filed probably won't pass as it's filed. There needs to be a compromise between law enforcement and advocates. And so what you need to do, what I ask you to do, I put it like that, is to make sure that you sit down with local law enforcement within your city or your county, be they chiefs of police, be they the unions, your city council, and look at the legislation and come up with some ideas. If for some reason, some of the aspects of this legislation is unacceptable, because no legislation is perfect, I assure you that, then don't just say it's unacceptable, but come up with a viable solution to deal with the problem. This organization, better than any other organization that I know of, will have a lot of political power in order to get things done as a partner in making certain that we have police and law enforcement accountability in the state of Texas. So Josh, I'll open it up to questions at this point.
Thank you, Senator. There's been a few that have come in too. And I think I'm back on your screen. I wanted to make sure you had the full screen, everybody. One of the ones is I heard yes, but I want to make sure that everybody hears is the question is, will no-knock warrants be banned? And I heard you talk about a duty to identify.
Yes. There's other legislation that deals with no-knock warrants. It's not contained in this particular bill, but there's the Bolton-John Act. I think it's in Bolton-John, but if not, I am having legislation that's filed and that the Breonna, and we're calling it Breonna Taylor.
Good. Yeah, I imagine this is a personal question now. There will likely kind of be an omnibus bill. And for those that don't know what that means, a big bill that they put a lot of provisions into, and then some smaller ones and breaking it. Is that part of the strategy, or I didn't ask that question well at all.
Guess what, Josh? I'm not going to answer that question right now either. Suffice it to say that we will utilize the most optimal parliamentary and legislative strategies in order to get this done. Fair enough?
Very fair. Thank you, Senator. That's helpful too. So I have one question about it has to do with a national model. Is there a national model bill, or is it going to vary from state to state, the various George Floyd Acts? And I guess that's kind of a question about what's the national picture look like in the conversation.
There was a bill filed in Congress that passed the House. I don't know whether it has everything that we have in this particular bill, but it languished in the Senate. And I think that there may be a chance in terms of passing a national model. In fact, Madam Vice President was a co-author, I believe, on the bill in the Senate. So I think that there is an opportunity to get something done at the federal level.
And then at the local level, I heard you mention, because so much of policing is this interplay of federalism. A lot of the things are local, if I recall, that maybe we need to be doing to help do reform at a local level. Are there local reforms we should also be watching for?
Sure, I think that you should also always look at local police policy. Okay, and when the city council is talking about adopting new policy, you as citizens need to be very involved in reading that policy, making recommendations to the creation of the policy, and that's at the local level. What I like is making certain that we have consistency across the state of Texas, and that's what I'm striving for.
And so there was one hopefully easy question: is there a Senate bill number we should be watching for yet? Has it been filed?
Yes, and the reality is that it's my Senate bill, and I don't have the Senate number here. What I will do, though, is make certain that I get it and get it to you, Josh, so we can make sure everyone knows about it.
Thank you, Senator. I was telling him earlier that I had over 1,200 bills that had been filed already, and about almost 600 in my track. So that we're at that.
Right.
It was just a question, and one particular person wanted the number already if they could get to work. So that's a good sign.
Good.
So the one question, has your bill gone to committee? No, it hasn't gone. We haven't had committees. Well, I guess the Senate has appointed committees, but not meetings yet.
That's good.
This was one that I actually thought had a question of myself. Is there anything similar to what healthcare workers have with healthcare worker misconduct registries for law enforcement? And the follow-up part of it is too many times officers face possible sanctions, but then move on to other agencies. Sort of like school teachers too, if I recall.
Right. And, obviously, I want to make certain, as an attorney, I believe in due process, okay? And you're right. We've got to make certain that we look at that issue. It's the gypsy cop issue, okay? And I know that in the federal legislation, it was proposed. I don't know whether it actually stayed in there or not. But yes, we're going to be proposing that in one of our other bills, not necessarily the George Floyd Act.
There's a question about, could you maybe expound a little bit on what progressive sanctions are? Sure.
We're asking, in the state of Texas, there's a state agency called TCLO, Texas Law Enforcement Commission, okay? Commission on Law Enforcement. And so heretofore, my friends, believe it or not, it's been a toothless tiger as it relates to the regulation of law enforcement. Frankly, it's been pretty much relegated to just a licensing agency. And so we're trying to make certain that gets more powers and authority. And so one of those powers and authorities, we're going to be asking through this legislation to develop a model policy on the use of deadly force. And that should be adopted by all local law enforcement agencies so that we can have consistency in policies concerning the use of deadly force. And as they go about developing that policy, we want to make certain that there's citizens' input into drafting what that policy needs to be. In addition, and it's not necessarily TICO, we're asking Texas Southern University to come up with a model policy for local law enforcement agencies to deal with, you heard me talk about the misdemeanor fine only offenses. We need to make sure we come up with model policy for police departments to adopt in terms of the use of that particular law. Because, obviously you come up with the policy, the law, the policy, and then you have to have the training associated with it so police officers will know how to implement it.
We have another question that goes to the earlier point about we're asking police to do too much. It's a tough budget year, but are there funding or other proposals that maybe don't require an appropriation to better support the support personnel for police on a call, like for mental health calls, to have a social worker go along, or other ways to try to take some of these dog catcher duties also? Not that mental health is, those are two separate things.
I know exactly what you mean.
I heard myself and I was like, oh boy, I'm being recorded.
I think all of us understood exactly what you meant. One of the things I've been able to do, my friends, I've served on the Senate Finance Committee for many years. And so I'm kind of a student of public finance, okay? And so when you ask, are there other resources available for that particular purpose? Sure, but it ends up being a partnership between the federal government, state, and county and or local units of government. To the extent that it's a priority, then yes, the state will put some money in, but monies need to come in too from its partners at the local level. I think I look at Dallas as an example. Dallas has set up a program with Parkland Hospital in order to make certain that we begin to send mental health partners out with police when we know it's a mental health call. And so I want to see that implemented throughout the entire state. Don't know what the cost is, but it is going to be a cost. And I think that the state needs to, how should I say, participate, but make certain also that the local units of government are doing the same thing.
I have another question that's kind of broader than criminal justice. And this is, I think, super important as well, because racial equity is so much more than just criminal justice. Are there other pieces of legislation in addition to what we've talked about that would help us dismantle white supremacy in our state?
Well, thank you for the question. Here's the deal. This is my 28th year as a state senator. And I have been dealing with this equity issue for some 28 years. And my friends, what I continue to hear is this: these things take time. I've heard that over and over and over again. But when we do an analysis of poverty, single head households, violence rates of violence, rates of incarceration, juvenile, and also penitentiary. And when we look at dropouts, when we look at mental health, look at COVID. What we see are African Americans and Latinos disproportionately represented in all of those particular categories. And we still haven't, in the 28 years that I've been here, made any real significant, we made some progress, but not significant progress. We are wasting resources when we have to deal with murder rates, when we have to deal with persons going to the penitentiary, when we have to deal with young kids in our juvenile justice system. We're wasting resources. What I have asked, that really haven't been responded to in the manner in which I'd like to respond to, give me being General LeBron, not me personally, the resources to fix some of these problems in the community, and then hold me accountable for coming up with the programs, having them vetted by evidence-based groups, and then let me attempt to implement them and see what type of results we get across the spectrum, in terms of employment. And so, yes, there are and continue to be initiatives to deal with this issue on a broad-based scale. But the question becomes one of whether or not we get receptivity from our colleagues in the Republican Party.
Well, that brings me to a question that I know Scott will want me to ask. We have members throughout the state. We may not be majorities, but we're pervasive. What recommendations do you have for them when they meet with their elected officials? Is there a good, like, do you have any advice on how to message it?
Yes, on a consistent basis, okay? You know, this is, let me give you an example. Today was the first hearing of the redistricting committee, all right? And we had virtual testimony for the first time. You know what that means? That means that each and every one of you had the opportunity of keeping your pajamas on, putting a shirt on, the coat on, tie on, or whatever the case may be, and testifying. You need to make certain that you look at your local units of government to figure out whether or not they have virtual input, and make sure that you have that input. Again, you heard earlier, what I said to you is that as it relates to the Senate bill and the House bill, the George Floyd Act, and I'll get the number, the Senate number, someone put into the chat the House bill number already. You need to make certain that you talk to your local leaders. And if you need to know specifically who to talk to, get with Josh. Josh will get with me, and we'll make certain we'll give you a list of persons to talk to. You need to talk to your police unions. They've got to be a part of the process. We've got to take their perspective into account in drafting legislation. It's important, okay? We've got to talk to the police administrators, the city council, the persons who are over, to the extent you have this. There may very well be a law enforcement committee at the city council level. Talk to the chair of that committee or members on there. There's a lot of work that you can do in order to make this a reality. And frankly, it's easier now than it's been in the past, even though, you know, I want to make sure that I'm able to shake Josh's hand and things of that nature, have personal interaction. But it's easier now, as witnessed by the hearing that we had this morning out in West Texas, to get citizens' input into our decision-making process.
Yeah, so one question that's come in that you're obviously free to answer, but I'll answer for you based on you'll see why. It has the legislation prepared, included input from the Texas police chiefs, and I know your processes and your collaboration on all stakeholder things has always been admirable. But you're free to opine on that if you want.
I'm gonna tell you a story. When I was a young senator, I'd have people come into the office with their lobbyists come into the office, and they'd come in, there'd be a bill, and they'd come in and tell me their side of the story and say, Senator, we need your support. This is why we need your support, okay? And then a few days later, somebody else would come in and say, Senator, we need your support, with a different perspective now, and say, Senator, we need your support, okay? Then I finally figured out as a lawyer, I said, you know, I will sit here and waste a lot of time trying to figure out what the right position should be as it relates to allowing people to have input. So this is what I did. What I did, if there was a specific state agency that had jurisdiction over the issue, I'd invite both sides, or how many other sides there would be, to a common meeting and have the state agency there to kind of filter, I was going to say, kind of filter what was being said. And by doing that, I was able to get a better perspective, not such a biased perspective on the issue, okay? Why am I telling you that? Because that's the same process that I use now. I make certain that I understand that before legislation can move, there are three people in this Capitol You have the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker. And we've got to try to make certain we're working with them in order to get legislation passed, because otherwise it won't get passed. So, I could pass a bill out of the Senate, you get out of the House, gets to the governor's desk, and he vetoes it. So I put all of that work into something that he vetoes. And so I know that I've got to have the police chiefs at the table. I know which groups need to be at the table in order to get something passed. I'll give you this example. It's a long answer. Some of you may or may not have heard of the Community Safety Education Act that I passed a couple of sessions ago. And frankly, what it is defining behavior expectations of citizens and police officers during interactions. And suffice to say, what we ended up doing was able to get all of the different shareholders to the table. The NAACP, the League of, no, I should say not the League of Women's Voters, but the police chiefs, the ACLU, LULAC, the unions, got them all to the table and said, here's a simple question. What are the behavior expectations of police officers and citizens during a traffic stop, as an example? And so we put down everything we could agree on in one section and what we couldn't agree on another sheet of paper. So those things that we agreed on, everybody signed off on, and a few things that was in the other section we got signed off on too. And guess what we did? We all agreed to put it in the driver's license manual, the perfect place. So citizens trying to get a driver's license would be able to have that content and would be tested at least on some of that content on the driver's license test. And so that's kind of my system of trying to bring consensus and bring people together to get things done.
Yeah, Senator, most of the bills, very few get, it's like the scene in Hamilton, the song about you don't have the votes. Most of them don't go that way. Most of them are done through broad stakeholder processes and don't move until they have consensus, and that's the way it should be. And
right, I agree.
Yeah, anyway, we can talk about the new rules in the Senate. That might be a little too far off.
The elections have consequences, okay?
They do indeed, Senator.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that just came in, I'm paraphrasing, forgive me. So these things, they seem pretty common sense to me. What are some of the objections, though, coming from across the aisle or coming from some of the police? Like, help me have some idea, like, what are the barriers? And if you have any idea, what are they thinking? What are they saying? What are they concerned with?
I think the biggest barrier is going to be the immunity issue, okay? The fact is that I've been talking to police unions, and we agree on a lot of the aspects of this. We hadn't agreed on the immunity aspect of it, nor the progressive sanction aspect of it. So that's kind of the big ones as I see it. But I think we're going to have a broad-based agreement on many aspects of it.
And I know we talked about progressive sanctions. I had another question come in about that. Does that help address repeat problems that sometimes occur with certain officers?
Yes, right. And the whole purpose is this: as you have progressively more misconduct on the part of police officer, it ratchets up the sanctions associated with that finding. And if you're going through a civil service process, then the civil service officer must take the rulings, if you will, of the prior rulings concerning the sanction as at face value, must presume that they were fair and according to policy in making a determination concerning the appeal.
So when some of our ladies walk into a legislative office, they might find some of them live all across the state, so some districts are easier than others. When they go to one of those meetings, what are they likely to run into as far as resistance that they will need to be able to answer and overcome?
All right, this is what I'd ask. Thank you for asking that question. Very good question. Those of you that are interested in helping with this effort, make certain that you get in the chat room, put your name, your contact information, and Josh, please collect that information for us, okay? And then what we will do is have a training session in terms of what we're going to be asking you to do as it relates to contacting your local police department, contacting the mayor, contacting your state representative, and all those types of things, okay? And so please make certain that if you are willing to help with this, to provide us your contact information, and we will have a training session about concerning.
That's amazing, Senator. I would like to do that personally.
Okay.
Speaking only for myself, well, we're a multiracial group, but we're not as multiracial as we should be. And I think that sometimes one of the big barriers, speaking for somebody with my skin color, is not knowing what the experiences of our fellow Americans have been, and knowing even how to talk to law enforcement to be a good friend or ally. I think we don't have the words sometimes or know what to do. So I would like to attend that training myself. And
that's fine. You know, we'll do it virtually.
That box blow up as we talk about that. So I had.
See, that's great.
That's great. Yeah, this is well, we represent many different denominations, and I should not have a favorite, and I don't. But this one is a very, very good group. In fact, changing the subject slightly, one of them enjoys art and wants to know about the painting behind your desk before we wrap it up.
Okay.
Addressing your point of getting people to the table, it appears the painting behind your desk with the former president speaks to that. Could you talk about your painting?
Yes, I tell you what, man, I can't even recall what our art story was. Hopefully you can see. Let me go up a little. All right. And what it is, it's a picture of all the Democratic presidents up to Clinton. I don't have the one with Obama in it yet. And they're all sitting at the table, and notice who has all the chips. Clinton ends up having all the chips at the table. Okay. But I just thought it was something that I needed to have here in the office to just kind of reflect all the way back to FDR in terms of presidents that were Democrats here in this country and their legacy. Now we have a new president, Joe Biden, and I don't know about you, but last Tuesday when I went to bed, I still had this heavy burden on my shoulders. I felt like Atlas holding up the world. And then when Wednesday morning came, when morning came, when we went from dark to light, and Joe Biden was sworn in as the 46th president of the United States, in his speech about bringing people together, not red and blue, but bringing people together and making certain that we understand and appreciate one another. You know, I learned a long time ago. I was one of the first African Americans to graduate from my high school. Just because I may not like Josh or Josh may not like me, it's not because of the color of my skin in many instances. It may very well be personality, you know? It may very well be that he or I don't like a particular personality trait that the other one might have, not the color of their skin. And so we've got to make sure we're sensitive to those types of things and not use the racism word so liberally, if you will. And then make certain that we continue to try to build bridges amongst ourselves. It still never, ever just I'm profounded, by the fact that on Sunday morning, it's still the most segregated time, unfortunately, in our week. And we've got to do a better job.
So two more, the questions just keep trickling in, Senator. So I thought we were wrapping up, and then apparently that was the prompt to send more questions in. So two that are, I'll start with one at a time. It's going to be an interesting session trying to do this with the pandemic. And everybody's struggling with it. And, you know, we were chatting this morning a little bit about how, as a lobbyist, it's sort of like, it's not just the risk to my health, the staff have to be there, and an in-person meeting puts them in danger. And if you're a lobbyist, you really don't want to tick off the staff. That's just not a good strategy. What do you recommend about the best way for people to go about meeting with their legislators in this era when you can't just walk in anymore? You know, how do people best get in touch for our membership?
Well, you need to be strategic, first of all. Don't think that every day you're going to be able to walk into the Capitol office or a district office. Make certain that the legislation that you need to see me about, as an example, or a staff person about, is critical legislation. Do your best to make certain you communicate virtually. Try to get a call, get an appointment, communicate via Zoom or some other platform. Still use the emails, use that, use call, and, you know, and then if necessary, do a meeting. Let me just kind of tell you what's going on in the Capitol. Most senators and House members are not allowing people to just walk in anymore. We just can't do it because we got to protect our staff and ourselves. And so we're telling people that they need to make an appointment. And in some instances, we're not allowing them in. We will meet them outside of the office because we've got to keep this area until we get this pandemic behind us. Just got to make sure we maintain the safety of this particular space that everyone's working.
Switching back to the bill. Right. I'm all over the place, Senator. I apologize. It's
that's okay.
COVID is in Zoom. Is there any part of the bill that would address retraining and psychological evaluations for police officers?
Oh, training for certain. Psychological evaluation would also be a part of the recruitment process. So not specifically, but training is implicit within the bill itself.
And then I had one that I've just personally wondered about. People often reveal their thoughts on social media, their real thoughts. If I was an officer, I would want to make sure that the bad apples were identified. Is there a way that are there any ideas that I'm unaware of how to make sure that, I hate to use the word infiltration, it's too conspiracy-ish, but there are a few bad apples that have racist views. Is there any way to identify them and remove them before a bad thing happens, not just for bad actions taken?
I think that people on the police department know who the racists are, individuals with racist tendencies, you know, and you know it should be reported by their colleagues, because it only makes it worse for everyone if they don't report those tendencies. And there are ways to do that without being personally identified. I mean, the police department have, in urban areas, I know, have the ability to be able to do that. And some of the small areas, it may very well be problematic, because it may very well end up being that the police chief's nephew's cousin, brother's uncle, brother's cousin is on the police department. You know what I mean? Okay.